Single Dad took the last seat on a plane. But the woman in first class said, "Bring him here." The terminal was a storm of rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, and parents trying to corral wandering children. Jake Bennett clutched his 2-year-old daughter tighter, her warm head resting against his shoulder, her breath fast and shallow from the lingering cold that wouldn't let go. Her tiny backpack dangled from his wrist. His own duffel was slung over his back, half-zipped the worn canvas held together by duct tape and stubbornness. Last call for Flight 237 to Chicago Gate C-12. Final boarding. He cursed under his breath and picked up the pace, weaving through the crowd as Lily whimpered softly against him. She hadn't stopped coughing since sunrise. This wasn't just a trip anymore. It was a race against time. The pediatric specialist in Chicago, Dr. Martin, was retiring in 3 days. Jake had spent every last favor dollar and ounce of pride he had calling in contacts, filing old insurance appeals, and begging the scheduler for one final appointment. And he got it, just one. One last chance for Lily to be seen by someone who still believed in treating a child like a person, not a case file. But only if they made it to Chicago. He reached the gate just as the last agent was about to pull the rope across the entrance. "Wait," Jake shouted. "Please, I need to be on that flight." The gate agent, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a tired posture, hesitated. "Sir, the flight's full. Standby's already closed." Jake shook his head. "There's got to be something, anything. My daughter's sick. We have to get to Chicago today. Please." She tapped something on her terminal, frowning. "I'm sorry. Unless someone cancels in the next minute, we're out of options." As if on cue, her earpiece crackled. She turned, slightly listened, and then typed quickly. A beat. Her eyes met Jake's. "You're in luck. Someone just missed their connection. One seat just opened, but it's in the very back. 31F, non-reclining right by the restroom. Jake didn't care if it was a crate in the cargo hold. I'll take it." She handed him the boarding pass. "Good luck, sir." He thanked her, adjusted Lily against his chest, and jogged down the jet bridge. The door was already half closed behind the final passengers. A flight attendant took one look at him, sweat-soaked shirt, toddler in arms, pure desperation in his eyes, and simply nodded him on. He found the seat. It was worse than he imagined. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something more pungent beneath. The seat was wedged against a bulkhead wall and a line for the lavatory. But it didn't matter. He eased into it, trying not to jostle Lily. Her cough had turned wet and rattling. She stirred in his arms, started fussing, then began crying outright. Jake bounced her gently. "Shh. It's okay, sweetheart. We're almost there." Across the aisle, a man in a business suit frowned and put in his earbuds. A row up, a woman gave him a look that blended pity with annoyance. Jake kept his head down. He'd learned how to be invisible. Being a single dad in public often meant surviving the quiet judgment of strangers who had no idea what it took to get a child this far in life. Alive, loved, and still smiling, even if a little sick. Lily's cries grew louder. Jake tried everything, her favorite lullaby hummed under his breath, the soft tapping rhythm on her back, the gentle rock side to side. Nothing worked. The flight attendant approached. "Sir, would you like some water or a blanket?" He nodded gratefully. "A blanket, please." She returned with one and whispered, "You're doing great. She's just tired." Jake nearly broke, then just that one sentence of kindness undid him more than any glare or sigh ever could. He wrapped Lily tighter and leaned his head back, eyes closed. For the first time in hours, the weight of the day began to settle. He hadn't slept since the night before. He couldn't afford to. Between finishing his shift at the auto shop, fixing a last-minute furnace emergency for a neighbor to cover gas money, and packing for a 2-day trip on $0, there hadn't been time for rest. The hum of the engines deepened. They were taxiing. Jake opened his eyes to a blur of light and shadow and noticed a flight attendant hurrying toward him, eyes locked on a message in her earpiece. She stopped at his row. "Mr. Bennett." He sat straighter, suddenly defensive. "Yes, you and your daughter. Would you mind moving to the front of the plane? A passenger in first class has requested your relocation. Jake blinked. I think you've got the wrong guy. No, sir. Passenger in seat 1A specifically asked for you and your daughter. She's insistent. Jake hesitated. Look, I didn't mean to bother anyone. We'll keep it down. No, sir, it's not a complaint. She asked kindly. Please follow me. Jake clutched Lily tighter and stood unsure if this was real or some odd misunderstanding. Passengers around him craned their necks to watch as he followed the attendant up the aisle. Every step felt like walking through a dream or a trap, he couldn't tell which. Then he saw her. Seat 1A. A woman in her mid-30s dressed in understated elegance. Wavy chestnut hair tucked behind one ear. Clear green eyes that seemed to see everything but reveal nothing. She didn't look surprised when he appeared. Just calm. Certain. She gestured to the seat beside her. He can sit here. The attendant nodded, motioning Jake into 2B. Jake hesitated. Why? The woman smiled faintly. You look tired. Let her rest. It's the least I can do. Her voice was smooth composed, yet something fragile flickered beneath it. Jake sat bewildered. Lily, as if sensing a change in altitude or perhaps warmth, nuzzled into his chest and fell asleep within seconds. The woman looked down at the little girl. For a fraction of a second, her expression shifted. A tremor of loss, of recognition. Then it vanished. Jake finally spoke. Thank you. I don't know why you... She cut him off gently. It's fine. Just rest. He looked at her again more closely this time. Something about her was hauntingly familiar. But he couldn't place it. Not yet. And neither of them knew. They were about to change each other's lives forever. The silence in first class was unlike anything Jake had felt in years. No coughing, no whirring machines, no clanging wrenches or crying toddlers, just the hum of jet engines and the low rustle of pages turning in expensive magazines. Lily slept soundly now, her fevered forehead resting against his chest, a light snore whistling from her nose. The thick seat beneath him cradled his spine like a luxury he had no business experiencing. Everything smelled of leather citrus and something calming like cedar wood. Across from him, the woman in 1A sipped mineral water from a crystal glass. Jake studied her out of the corner of his eye. She wasn't just wealthy. She moved like someone used to making decisions and being obeyed. There was nothing flashy in her appearance, no glittering jewelry, no designer logos, just clean, effortless elegance. A pale blue silk blouse, navy trousers, and a silver watch that looked more functional than decorative. She didn't look at him, but he could sense she was aware of his every movement. Her posture was still yet alert. She sat like someone trained to absorb a room before stepping into it. Jake cleared his throat. You didn't have to do this. She turned slightly, finally meeting his eyes. I know, she said simply, but I wanted to. Jake waited for a condition and explanation. None came. Are you a flight attendant, manager, or something, he asked, fumbling for context. A small smile ghosted across her lips. No, just a passenger. He didn't believe that for a second. Normal passengers didn't request strangers from the back to be upgraded mid-flight, and flight crews didn't scramble like that unless someone held real authority. She turned back toward the window, and the conversation, such as it was, seemed closed. Jake shifted uncomfortably, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's damp forehead. Her skin felt a little cooler. That was something. He looked down at her at the little hands curled into fists, the cheeks flushed from sleep, and felt the familiar blend of exhaustion and awe. She was the one thing he hadn't failed at. Not completely. He leaned his head back, suddenly aware of how heavy his limbs felt. The darkness behind his eyelids pulled at him. He must have drifted because the next thing he knew, he felt a soft weight settling over his lap. A cashmere blanket tucked carefully over Lily's legs. He opened his eyes. The woman was adjusting the blanket with careful hands, her movements quiet and efficient. As she leaned closer, Jake noticed the faint scent of lavender and something else, maybe vetiver. It reminded him of something safe, something he couldn't quite name. She caught him watching and paused. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. She looked cold. Jake swallowed. "No, thank you. That's very kind." She nodded, straightened, and looked out the window again. There was something in her gaze, distant but not distracted, like she wasn't just looking at the clouds but at memories long buried in them. Jake couldn't help himself. "Do you have kids?" The question landed between them like a dropped tray. Her lips parted slightly, but for a few seconds no sound came out. Then she exhaled. "I did." Jake's breath caught. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's okay," she said quickly, eyes still on the window. "You couldn't have known." There was a pause. Not awkward, just tender, heavy. Jake lowered his eyes. "My wife? She didn't make it through childbirth. I wasn't ready to be a father, still not most days." He didn't know why he said that. He hadn't told a soul outside his mechanic buddies in passing. But, sitting here next to this stranger, the words had found their own way out. The woman looked at him now. Really looked. Her green eyes were clearer than before, less distant. "She'd be proud of you," she said. Jake let out a tired breath, smiling bitterly. "You don't know me." "No," she said. "But I know the look of someone who hasn't slept in days and still puts someone else first." She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned her attention back to her drink. Jake blinked away a sudden sting in his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if debating whether to give him a real answer. Finally, Evelyn. Jake. They shook hands awkwardly since Lily was still asleep in his arms, but it was a moment of something shifting. A recognition. "I feel like I've seen you before," he added. Maybe in a magazine or something. Evelyn gave him a small amused look. "Maybe. Or maybe I just have one of those faces." Jake almost laughed, but something in her tone suggested he shouldn't press. A flight attendant approached, asked if they needed anything. Evelyn declined. Jake just asked for water. As the attendant walked away, Evelyn leaned back in her seat. Her fingers brushed against her wrist where a charm bracelet rested beneath the edge of her sleeve. A tiny gold airplane dangled from it. Jake noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he looked down at Lily again and whispered, "We're gonna make it, baby girl." Evelyn heard it. Her fingers curled tighter around her glass. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane began its slow descent toward Chicago. The golden light of late afternoon spilled through the windows, warming the cabin with a kind of quiet magic. For a few brief minutes, Jake forgot about medical bills, overdue rent, and the loneliness that had clawed at him for the last 2 years. And Evelyn forgot about sterile hospital rooms, press interviews, and the empty nursery she hadn't had the courage to clear out. In 2B and 1A, something unnamed had begun. Not love, not yet, but the first fragile spark of something neither of them believed in anymore. Hope. The flight had begun its steady cruise above the clouds, the sun casting golden ribbons over the wing outside Evelyn's window. But her thoughts weren't on the horizon. They were tethered to the small child asleep in the arms of the man beside her, and the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he too finally surrendered to exhaustion. Evelyn Hart had spent the last 5 years mastering the art of self-control on stage in boardrooms across negotiating tables where billions hung in the balance. But now, seated next to this stranger and his feverish daughter, her carefully constructed armor was beginning to crack. She hadn't expected it. It started with the sound of that child's cry, a sound she hadn't heard since the night she lost her own baby. The kind of sound that bypassed logic and protocol and reached straight into the softest, most haunted parts of her. When she first heard it echoing from the back of the plane, it had caught her off guard. She'd flinched, then stiffened, then inexplicably stood up. The flight attendant had turned startled. "Miss Hart, is everything all right?" Evelyn hadn't answered right away. She simply looked back toward the rear of the plane, her vision narrowing to the aisle. She had said the words before she could think them. "Bring him here." The attendant blinked. "Excuse me, the man holding the crying child. I want them moved up here. Seat 2B is open. We don't usually transfer passengers like that once boarding is. Tell the captain if you have to." Evelyn had said not harshly but with a finality that made further argument impossible. "I'll sign whatever's necessary. Just bring them here." Back in the present, Evelyn glanced sideways. Jake was asleep, but not peacefully. His brow was furrowed even in rest. A man who had forgotten what it meant to relax, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. His daughter shifted in his arms, murmuring something incoherent before snuggling deeper against his chest. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had bought this airline 5 years ago. Not for the prestige, not even for the money. She'd bought it because flying had always meant something to her freedom, escape the illusion of control. Up here, everything was quiet, predictable. Altitude made the world look small and manageable. But right now, nothing felt small. Nothing felt safe. Evelyn closed her eyes, and for a moment she wasn't in first class. She was back in the hospital clutching a bassinet that would never be filled, listening to doctors whisper about fetal distress and cord accidents and how these things just happen. They'd told her it wasn't her fault, and she had believed them. Until the silence settled in. Until she came home to a nursery with untouched walls and tiny clothes that still smelled of dreams. Until her ex-husband, now stopped coming home altogether. Evelyn turned her gaze back to the man beside her. Jake hadn't stirred. His jaw, strong and slightly stubbled, was clenched in his sleep as if he were bracing for something. Battle-worn, but not bitter. There was a quiet nobility in how he held his child arms curled protectively, his own neck bent awkwardly to shield her from the cool cabin air. She reached down almost without thinking and adjusted the blanket that had slipped from Lily's feet. Her hand paused briefly above the child's tiny toes, then withdrew quickly as if she'd touched a flame. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses and a pearl brooch was watching. "You've got a kind heart," the woman said, smiling softly. Evelyn stiffened slightly. "It's not that," she murmured. The woman just nodded knowingly. "Whatever it is, I think you were meant to be on this flight." Evelyn didn't reply. She didn't believe in fate. Not anymore. And yet, this man, this child, she'd chosen them, hadn't she? On a whim, or maybe not a whim at all. Maybe some deep-buried instinct had recognized something in them, a wound she couldn't see but could feel. The echo of grief. Because you don't forget the shape of absence. You recognize it in others like a secret handshake. The pilot announced their cruising altitude. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. A flight attendant offered her a warm towel, which she accepted more out of habit than need. She didn't notice the towel had gone cold in her hand until Jake stirred. His eyes blinked open, slowly unfocused, then landed on Evelyn. His arms tightened protectively around Lily instinctively before he realized where he was. "I'm sorry," he said, voice gravelly. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." "You needed it," Evelyn said gently. "Both of you." He rubbed his eyes, looked down at Lily, then at her. "Still not sure how I ended up here." She hesitated, then replied, "Maybe I just wanted to remember what it felt like to hear a child breathe in their sleep." Jake stared at her, something in his eyes softening. Understanding. Not pity, not confusion. Recognition. "I'm sorry," he said quietly and meant it. He didn't need details. That sentence said everything. She offered him a nod of gratitude. The silence between them now felt different. Not heavy, not distant, but shared. Jake sat up straighter, shifting Lily slightly. "I never got your full name." "Evelyn," she said with the faintest smile. "Evelyn Hart." Jake's brow furrowed. The name registered somewhere. He'd seen it, read it, but he let it go. "I'm Jake Bennett," he said, "and this troublemaker is Lily." Lily stirred just slightly, and for a second Evelyn saw a flicker of light in the child's sleepy eyes. It was a look of trust, innocent, undeniable. Something loosened inside her. As the cabin lights glowed dim, Amber Evelyn leaned back into her seat and Jake sat quietly beside her. Lily nestled between two people who had forgotten what it meant to believe in beginnings. But somewhere in the thin air and flickering lights of that flight something had begun to take root, slowly, tentatively like hope, on the edge of grief. And it all started with 3 words whispered at 30,000 feet. Bring him here. By the time the flight passed its halfway mark, the sky outside had darkened into a deep velvet blue stars scattered faintly across the curve of the earth. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting soft halos over tray tables and sleeping passengers. In seat 2B, Jake sat still watching Lily's chest rise and fall beneath the pale blue blanket. Her fever had eased slightly, but a dry cough still escaped her every few minutes. Across the aisle, no one stared anymore. The novelty of the man from coach and the little girl who'd cried her way into first class had worn off. But between Jake and Evelyn, the quiet had only deepened and thickened with something unspoken. Evelyn hadn't said another word since she gave her name. Jake hadn't pressed, not out of politeness, out of instinct. It was the same instinct he'd learned when he held his wife's hand during her final labor when the monitors had slowed and no one would meet his eyes. Some silences weren't meant to be broken. They had to be respected even when they carried weight enough to crush you. Still, the silence between him and Evelyn wasn't hostile. It wasn't even cold. It was layered, fragile. Like a glass bridge they were both afraid to walk across. Jake leaned back slightly, adjusting Lily against his shoulder. She sighed in her sleep and clutched a fistful of his shirt. His neck ached. His back throbbed. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was with him, and that somehow, against all odds, she had slept soundly for nearly 2 hours beside a woman she'd never met. He glanced over. Evelyn's head was tilted toward the window again, but he noticed her hand resting in her lap clenched tightly around a delicate silver chain. At the end of it was a charm, small, golden, heart-shaped. Jake hesitated, then asked quietly, "Was that hers?" Evelyn didn't look at him. She loosened her grip on the charm, slowly. "Yes," she said. "It was part of the hospital keepsake box. They gave it to me after she was gone." Jake's voice was gentle. Your daughter Evelyn nodded once, still not turning. She never took a breath. Not one. The words were matter of fact, controlled, but Jake felt them like a punch to the chest. "I'm so sorry," he said. She finally looked at him, and for the first time since they met, Jake saw it all the years behind those green eyes, the weight she carried not in her body but in her bones. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "No one ever knows what to say anyway." Jake thought for a moment. "Maybe not. But I know what it's like to lose something and still have to keep breathing." Evelyn blinked, startled not by the sentiment but by the ease with which he said it. Jake leaned forward a little, careful not to disturb Lily. "After my wife passed, everyone tried to help. Neighbors brought food, friends called, people sent cards, but the silence was still the loudest thing in the house." Evelyn nodded. "I remember walking into the nursery after the funeral. It was like time stopped in there." Jake gave her a sad smile. "Grief doesn't keep a schedule." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. And it doesn't care how successful you are, or how well you hide it." Her voice dropped on the last word. Jake sensed that wasn't a statement, it was a confession. "Sometimes I feel like I'm 2 people," she continued. "There's the version everyone sees, confident, polished, in control. And then there's the version who wakes up at 3 a.m., wondering if she should have chosen a different hospital." Jake looked at her steadily. "You're not alone in that." They sat in quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Something passed between them, a mutual understanding that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with survival. They were both carrying losses the world expected them to have already moved past, but pain had no expiration date. Lily stirred again. This time her eyes blinked open, cloudy with sleep. Jake smiled down at her. "Hey, Munchkin. You're okay." Lily looked around, confused by the unfamiliar space, then turned her gaze toward Evelyn. Evelyn hesitated, unsure if she should smile or speak or look away. Lily solved it for her by reaching out small fingers, brushing Evelyn's coat sleeve. "Mama," she whispered, confused. Jake's heart dropped. "No, baby, that's not." But Evelyn raised a hand, stopping him gently. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling. She reached out and took Lily's hand in hers. "No," she whispered back. "I'm not your mama. But I'm glad you're here." Lily blinked sleepily, seemed content with that, and curled back against her father's chest. Jake didn't know what to say. He only knew that something had cracked open in Evelyn's face, a mixture of joy and ache and something like grace. He cleared his throat. "Thank you. For earlier. For all of this." Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't do it for you." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "That's reassuring." She smiled, a small, real smile. "I did it for her. For the little girl I never got to hold." Jake nodded. He understood. More than she knew? A chime rang through the cabin, signaling the final descent. The spell, such as it was, began to fade. Jake looked out the window, city lights glimmering like fireflies below. "We're almost there," he murmured to Lily. But part of him, an inconvenient, persistent part, hoped they weren't. Because this moment, this accidental alignment of pain and kindness and humanity felt like something he hadn't had in years, a beginning. And for Evelyn Hart, who had forgotten what it meant to let someone stay past the first conversation, it felt dangerously like a door she didn't know she wanted to open. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, rubber meeting runway beneath the quiet thrum of engines winding down. Cabin lights flickered to full brightness. Seat belts clicked. The usual rustle of passengers gathering their belongings filled the space, but in row 2, neither Jake nor Evelyn moved. Lily had fallen back asleep, tucked beneath her father's coat. Her tiny fingers curled around the fabric at his chest, her breath slow and warm. Jake cradled her instinctively, as if letting go even for a second would allow everything around him to unravel. Evelyn sat still, watching the boarding door open, her expression unreadable. Jake glanced over. "You don't look eager to leave." She exhaled through her nose, not quite a sigh. "I never do. Airports tend to have that effect on people," he offered, trying to keep the tone light. She turned to him slowly. "Airplanes, not airports." He raised a brow. "Difference being, in the air," she said, "there's no weight, no judgment, no history." Jake considered that. "You don't strike me as someone who runs from things." Evelyn looked away. "I don't run. I just pause where the world feels less cruel." A moment passed before she added, quieter, "It's the landing I always dread." Jake nodded. "Yeah, that's when everything waiting for you comes rushing back." They stood together, still not reaching for bags. Passengers flowed past like a stream around rocks, some offering polite nods or curious glances. "Where are you headed?" she asked. Jake looked down at Lily. "Children's Specialist Hospital, North Side." Evelyn's eyes flickered. "Dr. Martin?" He blinked. "You know him?" She nodded. "He consulted on my pregnancy. He's brilliant, old school. Heart first, data second." Jake smiled faintly. "That's what they told me. Said if we don't get in before Friday, we miss our shot." I pulled every string I had left. She tilted her head, searching his face, and after that, he hesitated. "I don't know. Probably head back home. I work nights at a repair shop. I take whatever jobs I can find to stay afloat. It's not glamorous, but it keeps us going." She watched him closely. "You gave up a lot, didn't you?" Jake met her gaze. "I didn't see it that way. Not at first. When my wife died, I thought I was just holding things together until someone came to fix it. But no one came. So I became the glue." Evelyn nodded slowly, something tender flickering in her eyes. That kind of love leaves a mark. He looked at her then, not just at her face, but into her. The layers, the walls, the fragile places she kept behind polished silence. "What about you?" he asked. Her lips twitched a half-smile. "You want the real version or the press release? Always the real." She glanced toward the window as the jet bridge connected. "I was 29 when I took over Hart Aviation. My father had built it up brick by brick. He died, suddenly aneurysm. No succession plan. The board didn't believe I was ready, so I made them believe." Jake listened quietly, impressed. Built the fleet, expanded international routes, launched the business class redesign all within 2 years. I got used to rooms full of people waiting for me to fail. Jake asked softly, "And did you?" She turned back. "Only in the ways that don't make headlines." Her voice caught ever so slightly. "I married a man who loved the image of me. Not the person. He was there when we lost the baby. But he left soon after. I stayed. I buried her. Then I buried the marriage." Jake's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Evelyn nodded, eyes glassy but steady. "I don't talk about her. I thought if I said her name out loud it would undo me. But watching you hold Lily, it made me remember something I wasn't ready to forget." Jake looked down. Lily stirred and he gently rocked her. "Sometimes I feel like everything I've built is made of sand, that at any moment it could collapse." Evelyn gave him a look filled with a rare kind of respect. "But you still build it. That's what makes you different." There was a pause, a moment of unspoken gravity between them, the kind that only comes when two people recognize the pieces they've both lost and the strength it takes to carry what remains. The aisle cleared. A flight attendant approached with a soft smile. "Miss Hart, Mr. Bennett, you're welcome to disembark at your convenience." Evelyn stood slowly. So did Jake, shifting Lily gently without waking her. They stepped into the jet bridge together, the cool air washing over them like the first breath after a long dive. Jake adjusted the strap of his duffel bag. "I should call a cab. I have a car waiting," Evelyn said, glancing at her phone. "Let me drop you at the hospital." Jake hesitated. "That's not necessary. I know," she replied, "but I'd like to. For her." She nodded toward Lily, who murmured softly in her sleep. Jake considered her offer his instinct to decline out of pride habit reflex, but something about this moment didn't feel transactional. It felt like grace. "All right," he said finally. "Thank you." As they walked side by side toward the terminal doors, Jake looked at Evelyn, not as the CEO, not as the stranger in 1A, but as a woman who had sat in the dark with him, shared silence, and chose to speak her pain anyway. He didn't know what came next. He didn't need to, because for the first time in a very long time someone had stepped into his world and stayed without judgment, without pity, without agenda. And maybe, just maybe, the ground beneath him wasn't made of sand after all. Maybe it was beginning to settle into something solid, something real. The sleek, black sedan pulled away from the arrivals curb with the quiet purr of precision engineering. Jake sat in the back seat, Lily asleep in his arms, her soft breath fogging a small patch of his jacket. Evelyn sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward, the picture of composed stillness. The silence between them now was different than on the plane. It was weighted not with grief, but with the strange calm that follows an emotional storm, the quiet in a room after everyone has stopped crying. "Thanks again for the ride," Jake said quietly. "You really didn't have to." Evelyn glanced sideways, her tone soft but firm. "I know. That's why it mattered." He met her eyes for a brief second, then looked down at Lily. The little girl whimpered in her sleep, clinging tighter to her father's chest. They pulled into the circular drive of the Children's Specialist Hospital, a modest but well-kept building nestled between two high-rise offices, the kind of place where miracles were quiet and hard-earned. The driver stepped out and opened the door for them. Jake shifted, carefully adjusting Lily, her head lolling against his shoulder. Evelyn stepped out first, then reached back instinctively to take his bag. "I've got it," he said, but her hand didn't move. "I'm coming in with you." He hesitated. "You don't have to," Evelyn cut him off gently. "I want to. Let me do this." Jake studied her for a moment. She wasn't doing this to fix him. She wasn't trying to play hero. She simply wanted to be near this child, to offer something good. And maybe Jake realized to rewrite a moment in her own past that never got a second chance. He nodded. Inside the lobby, the receptionist looked up with a practiced smile which flickered slightly when she saw Jake's worn jeans and weathered coat. "Appointment?" she asked. "Yes. Jake Bennett. For Dr. Martin." She tapped at the keyboard. "One moment. Ah, yes. I see your appointment. Insurance was verified last night, but the balance due." "We're covering it," Evelyn said before Jake could speak. The receptionist blinked. "Excuse me." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice crisp. "The Heart Foundation has an account with your hospital. Have the billing department charge all services for Lily Bennett under our pediatric grant." Jake's jaw tensed. "Evelyn." She turned to him, calm but unwavering. "This isn't charity. It's a program, one you qualify for." The receptionist gave a subtle nod, clearly familiar with Evelyn's authority. "Of course. I'll update the records." Jake stared at Evelyn. "You don't even know me." She met his gaze. "I know enough." He looked down, swallowing hard. There was something humbling about being helped when you weren't used to it, when you were the one who always figured things out with scraped knuckles and duct tape. Before he could say anything else, a nurse called out. "Mr. Bennett, we're ready." Jake stood slowly. Lily had stirred her eyelids, fluttering open. Evelyn leaned down, brushing a wisp of hair from the child's face. "Hi, sweetheart." Lily blinked at her bleary and confused, then reached out and touched Evelyn's fingers. Jake cleared his throat, his voice rough. "We'll be back soon." Evelyn nodded. "I'll wait." He paused, unsure why that mattered, but it did. The examination room was warm, painted in soft greens and blues. A mural of woodland creatures danced across one wall. Lily sat on the table legs swinging, while Dr. Martin, gray-haired, steady with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to the elbows, listened intently to Jake's halting explanation. He asked questions, real ones. Not from a checklist, but from experience. He didn't interrupt when Jake spoke. He asked about Lily's sleep patterns, her early development, her cough, the stubborn fever. He held her hand, gently made her giggle with a finger puppet, and took his time. When it was over, Dr. Martin leaned back with a thoughtful look. "She's smart," he said. "She's also delayed, but not in a way that's irreversible. With the right therapy speech, motor sensory integration, she'll thrive." Jake exhaled, slow and shaky. "You really think so? I know, so the doctor said. But the next 6 months are key." Jake nodded slowly, mentally calculating costs, time, logistics. Dr. Martin seemed to read his mind. "You've got help now. Use it." Jake didn't know how to respond, so he said what felt truest. "Thank you." When Jake stepped back into the lobby, Evelyn was seated in one of the plush chairs, legs crossed, flipping through a medical brochure she clearly wasn't reading. She looked up immediately, eyes searching his. "Well," he let out a breath. "It's not as bad as I feared. But it won't be easy." She smiled faintly. "Nothing worth it ever is." He took a seat beside her. Lily, now more alert, curled into his side and watched Evelyn cautiously. Jake turned toward her. "You really didn't have to wait." "I know," she said again, "but I wanted to see you come back with hope on your face." Jake let that sink in. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't manipulation. It was pure, rare kindness, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. He looked at her, long and slow. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Evelyn considered her answer. "Because I've spent years building things that made me feel powerful, but none of it ever made me feel connected. Not like this, not like now." Jake glanced down at Lily, who was gently reaching out toward Evelyn's charm bracelet again, fascinated. Evelyn extended her hand. Lily's tiny fingers brushed the golden airplane charm. Evelyn smiled. "She loves that thing," Jake said. "She can have it," Evelyn replied almost in a whisper. Jake looked at her sharply. "It means something to you." Evelyn nodded. "And now it means something more." The driver returned, waiting by the door. But Jake didn't stand up yet. Neither did she. The lobby had emptied. Outside, dusk was falling over the city, painting the sidewalk in muted orange light. For a long time they sat in that silence again. But now it was a silence filled with meaning. Not everything had to be said. Some beginnings spoke for themselves. Jake Bennett's apartment was the size of a closet with a view of nothing but the brick wall next door. The single-room layout forced his life into one small rectangle, a twin bed shoved into the corner, a threadbare couch that swallowed him whole, and a corner desk where bills and paperwork teetered in precarious stacks. On the kitchenette counter sat an enamel-drip coffee pot that had seen better days, its spout stained brown, its handle worn smooth. The aroma of stale coffee hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. It was Monday morning, or what passed for morning on the night shift. Jake staggered in at 7:15 a.m., a plate of half-eaten eggs still balanced precariously in his hand. He peeled off his work jacket, his bones protesting after a 12-hour shift at the auto repair shop. When he laid Lily carefully into her playpen, a modest wooden contraption he bought used off Craigslist. Her wide blue eyes blinked sleepily, then flashed with recognition. She reached out for him, and despite his fatigue, Jake felt a rush of warmth. He sighed, poured himself a cup of the bitter brew, and sat at the desk. The unpaid cell phone bill glared at him from the top of the stack, past due. Service suspended. Beneath it, rent notices and several medical invoices poked out from manila envelopes. Northside Children's Specialist Hospital. $2,743.56. Chicago Pediatrics Billing. Past due. He braced himself and opened the hospital envelope first. To his astonishment, the invoice inside wasn't addressed to him. Instead, a single sheet of hospital letterhead bore the following message: Northside Children's Specialist Hospital. ATN Billing Department, Re Lily Bennett, DOB 03-14-2022. Account number 0458-237-912. Effective immediately, all outstanding balances and future treatment costs for the above patient have been charged to Heart Foundation Pediatric Grant ID HF 905237. For questions regarding coverage, contact heartfoundation.org. 1-800-HEART-14. Thank you for choosing Northside Children's Specialist Hospital. Jake's heart thudded in his chest. He reread the letter to make sure there was no fine print, no hidden asterisks. Nothing. The total amount due, which just days ago had felt like a weight meant to break him, had been wiped away completely. He blinked, staring at the Heart Foundation Pediatric Grant in disbelief. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. How? Why? Who? He rifled through the rest of the paperwork: the outpatient therapy authorization form, the physical therapy estimate, several pages of clinical notes from Dr. Martin. Every medical fee, every projected cost for Lily's intensive speech and motor therapy for the next 6 months all bore the same notation: funded by Heart Foundation Pediatric Grant. "Kiss me, I'm dreaming," he muttered under his breath, though he knew no one was there to witness it except the peeling paint on the wall. Then he remembered Siet 1A. He dipped his head, trying to still the rapid pulse pounding in his neck. Memories of Evelyn's calm voice played in his mind. It's not charity. It's a program. One you qualify for. He paced the small space once forward, then back, every step echoing within him. With each circuit, doubt and gratitude warred inside him like two opposing currents. His pride bristled. He wasn't used to being helped, especially not by a stranger. But Lily's future was at stake. Would any pride matter if he secured a path forward for his daughter? He sank into the threadbare couch and rested his forehead in his hands. He remembered late-night drives to the pharmacy scraping together change for cough syrup. He'd pawned his father's old watch the week before to pay for a doctor's visit. He'd taken on an extra weekend shift, sacrificing the little time he had left for Lily. All to avoid what he now realized was inevitable. Tears gathered unbidden at the corners of his eyes. Not tears of weakness, he told himself, but of relief and something more hope. Hope. It was a fragile thing, like a crystal dropped in a dark room. He tiptoed within himself, afraid it might shatter if he grasped it too tightly. He heard a giggle. Lily had woken and was playing with her plush bunny, tugging at its ears with tiny fingers. Jake wiped his eyes, climbed to his feet, and gathered her into his arms. She nuzzled his shoulder, blinking up at him. He felt the weight of her trust settle over him, a mantle of love that made his heart both swell and ache. "Daddy's got good news," he whispered, stroking her hair. She blinked sleepily, her pudgy cheeks turning a faint rose. She reached for his chin with her chubby hand, and he kissed her palm, letting the warmth of her skin reassure him that life still held gentle moments even in their cramped, worn-out apartment. He set her down gently and walked to the kitchenette. Grabbing a fresh coffee mug, he splashed cold water on his face. He stared at his reflection in the stainless steel fridge door, dark circles under red-rimmed eyes, stubble shading his jaw, a shirt stained with grease from the shop. He looked every bit the tired single dad hanging on by a thread. But he also saw something else, someone who had been given a chance to heal an echo of a promise that his daughter would not go without because of his losses. He gathered Lily's mug and spoon her breakfast and carried them back to the couch. She squealed when she saw the pink slice of banana floating in her oatmeal. Jake smiled at her thoughts churning. He thought about Evelyn Hart. He remembered the softness of her eyes when Lily had whispered Mama an accident that had broken his heart and hers in the same moment. He remembered the way she'd watched them at the hospital as if she were bracing herself against a future she had lost. He remembered the gentle way she touched the charm bracelet around her wrist, a tiny golden airplane that had snagged Lily's attention more than once. He looked down at Lily now, her grin bright enough to light the dingy room. And he knew he would never forget. He could not let himself forget. He nudged Lily's spoon closer, then sat cross-legged on the floor to feed her by hand. With each bite, he repeated the same mantra. "You're going to be okay, kiddo. We're going to be okay." When Lily finished, she stretched, standing in his lap as if ready to explore the world. Jake grabbed his phone, a battered flip model kept alive by a prepaid plan, and stared at it. He had no credit. His last few dollars had been spent on formula. The letter from the hospital had arrived unexpectedly, but there was no money left for airtime. He flipped open the phone and saw 3 missed calls from an unknown number along with a voicemail notification. He swallowed. Could it be? He dialed the voicemail. "Mr. Bennett, this is Karen from Hart Foundation." The voice was calm, professional. "I'm just following up regarding our sponsorship of Lily Bennett's medical care. If you have any questions or need further assistance, please feel free to call me at 1-800-HEART-14. Good luck, and we wish Lily a swift recovery." The recording ended. No personal message from Evelyn. Just a standard line from a foundation employee. And yet hearing her name, Hart Foundation, echoed like a benediction. He closed his eyes, leaned his head back, and let out a long, shuddering exhale. He'd been running on adrenaline and anxiety for weeks. Now, for the first time, the tight knot in his chest loosened. He tucked the phone into his pocket, rose, and cradled Lily against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin. "Let's go for a walk, Princess," he whispered. She cooed in her sleep. He carried her to the door, slipping into his worn boots and jacket, and locked up behind them. The apartment felt smaller now, but in a good way, as if the walls themselves were applauding the shift in their fortunes. Outside, the air was crisp, the early morning sun casting long shadows down the street. It was a quiet neighborhood of row houses, each with a small stoop and a patch of grass or a potted plant. He walked slowly with Lily secure in his arms, the significance of the gesture echoing tenderly within him. They passed neighbors watering flowers, a newspaper left on a stoop, a dog walker and its leashed retriever greeting them with a wagging tail. As he headed back home, he noticed a small park a few blocks away, a grassy expanse with a worn slide and swings that squeaked whenever someone moved. It struck him that for the first time in a long while he could breathe. The impending hospital bills, the looming financial crisis, they were gone. In their place was something new, something fragile, the chance for normalcy, for stability, for hope. And he swore to himself that he would honor this gift. He'd work the long hours, yes, but he'd also make time for Lily's therapy sessions, driving her to and from every appointment. He'd find a way to mend the fractured parts of their life brick by careful brick. Reaching his apartment door, he paused, still feeling the sunlight on his face. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, as if exhaling fear and inhaling possibility. He glanced down at Lily, her eyelids fluttering open, and he smiled. Ready for breakfast, number 2, he asked, his voice soft, but filled with conviction. Her bright blue eyes flicked open and she cooed, "Dada." He laughed quietly. "Yeah, baby." "Dada's right here." He carried her back inside, feeling sturdier than he had in months. The envelope from the hospital lay on the table edges, frayed from being handled. He picked it up, looked at the Heart Foundation logo one more time, and brushed his thumb over the embossed letters. A new chapter had begun, not just for Lily's health, but for both of them. And as Jake set the letter down and began prepping oatmeal for the second time that morning, he whispered into the small apartment, "We're going to be okay." For the first time, it sounded like a promise. Jake didn't normally keep newspapers in the house. Everything he needed to know came from radio news or whatever headline was posted at the gas station while he fueled up. But this paper had been handed to him by Marcus, the owner of the garage, with a smirk and a slap on the back. "You've got fans now," Bennett Marcus had said, thrusting the folded front page into his grease-streaked hands. "Maybe you'll start charging more for oil changes." Jake had grinned awkwardly, thinking it was a joke, but when he unfolded the paper at lunch and wiped his hands on a rag, his breath caught in his chest. Chicago's youngest aviation tycoon returns to public eye. Evelyn Hart steps into spotlight with record-breaking pediatric grant. There she was, Evelyn. Not the woman in a soft blouse sitting beside him in seat 1A, not the quiet soul who touched Lily's hand with reverence, not the grieving mother who spoke of her daughter with a whisper, but Evelyn Hart in her armor. Press ready. Perfectly tailored suit, chin lifted, just enough eyes distant but polished. Beside her, the caption listed awards, titles, business achievements. A full-page profile told the rest of the story. Hart Aviation's recent philanthropic move, a new initiative in pediatric health, grants the first recipient already in treatment. Jake swallowed hard. He reread the paragraph twice. The Heart Foundation's new grant program launched this week with a quiet but impactful gesture, full sponsorship of long-term treatment for a 2-year-old girl named Lily Bennett, whose father Jake could not be reached for comment. He stared at the photo again. The face he remembered, yes, but with a whole different frame. This wasn't Evelyn on a plane lost in memory and grief. This was Evelyn, the public figure. The unreachable woman at the top of a skyscraper. His gut twisted not from betrayal, no, not that, but from something more fragile. Distance. She had given him and Lily a miracle, yes, but she had done it from her world, her stage, her castle in the sky. And he was just the man holding the wrench. He folded the newspaper and set it down on the break room table. His coworkers were joking around, passing fries, cursing at the radio, but the voices faded into background noise. He kept hearing one sentence over and over, could not be reached for comment. She hadn't asked, hadn't told him, hadn't said a word, and yet she had seen them, heard them, cared enough to move. Jake looked down at his hands. Grease still lined the edges of his nails. These hands, fixed engines, unplugged drains, held a child close in the middle of the night. But they didn't belong to the kind of man who appeared in headlines next to women like Evelyn Hart. After his shift ended, he drove home with the windows cracked open, the wind in his hair, and Lily babbling in the car seat behind him. She had just started stringing sounds together, a musical lilt of vowels and giggles, and Jake couldn't stop glancing back at her in the mirror, a grin tugging at his mouth despite everything. That evening, once Lily was asleep and the dishes were stacked drying on a towel, Jake unfolded the newspaper again. This time, he wasn't looking at the headline. He was looking at her eyes. There was something there buried behind the confidence behind the CEO pose, a flicker of sorrow, and also resolve. He turned the page and found a quote from the interview. "I believe in helping people quietly. The loudest changes don't always come from microphones. Sometimes they come from one seat on one flight." Jake leaned back slowly. One seat, one flight. She hadn't forgotten. She wasn't using Lily for press. She had protected Jake's name. And hers too. The grant was public, but the people inside the story had been left untouched. Anonymous. Safe. He closed the paper and stared at the ceiling. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe distance wasn't about status. Maybe it was about fear. About not knowing whether to cross the invisible line between gratitude and connection. Between a gesture and something more. Maybe she'd drawn that line so carefully out of respect, not rejection. He looked over at Lily's sleeping form tucked into her crib beneath a knitted blanket from a neighbor. Her tiny chest rose and fell with the rhythm of safety. He owed Evelyn something, not just thanks, but honesty. He opened his laptop, which took 3 tries to boot. The Wi-Fi was slow, but eventually he found it the Heart Foundation's official site. On the Contact Us page was a form impersonal and sleek, but at the bottom in small print was a line. Inquiries regarding private sponsorships may be directed to Ms. Evelyn Hart's assistant, elaine.bishop.heartfoundation.org. Jake stared at the address. His hands hovered above the keyboard. Then, slowly, he began to type. Subject: Thank you and something more dear. Ms. Hart, I saw the paper today. Not going to lie, it threw me. Not because I'm ungrateful. Far from it. You gave my daughter a future. That's not the kind of thing you can put into words or repay. But what struck me most wasn't the grant or the article. It was that you never said my name. You didn't turn our story into your spotlight. You let us keep it. You let me keep it. Thank you for that. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if you want to hear from me again. But if you do, if you ever want to know what your kindness built, we'll be at the playground off Belmont and Sycamore every Saturday around 10 a.m. Bring coffee if you come. Jake. He hit send before he could overthink it. Then he closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was bathed in soft streetlight. Calm. Ordinary. And yet everything had changed. The girl in the paper was no longer just a stranger with a grieving heart. She was someone who had given his life a second wind. And Jake. He was beginning to realize he wanted to know her beyond the headlines. The first snowfall of the season drifted down like a whispered invitation as Evelyn Hart stood at her office window high above the city. Chicago was already blurring into winter steel-gray buildings softened by powdery white taxis, leaving melted trails in the streets below. She cradled a mug of untouched tea between her palms, her mind far from board meetings and quarterly reports. Elaine, her assistant, had knocked gently 15 minutes earlier. Ms. Hart, we received a message from a Jake Bennett. The name had made Evelyn turn so quickly her tea nearly spilled. Elaine had handed her a printed email, cheeks flushed with curiosity she dared not voice. Evelyn waited until the door closed again, then read the message 3 times. Bring coffee if you come. It was such a simple invitation. And yet it undid her. She hadn't reached out after the grant. She told herself it was enough that her gesture, her silence, was respectful. Clean. Let him take the help and keep his pride. But now, reading his words, Evelyn understood something deeper. Jake hadn't been looking for charity. He'd been looking for connection. And so had she. Now, as snow tapped lightly against the glass, she made a decision. She turned from the window, picked up her coat, and left the office without a word. The playground was quiet for a Saturday, save for the crunch of boots in fresh snow and the delighted squeals of children chasing each other. A cluster of parents huddled near the benches, cups of coffee steaming in gloved hands. Evelyn spotted them immediately, Jake in his navy peacoat, Lily bundled in a puffy pink snowsuit, cheeks red with cold and glee. She was pushing a toy truck down a slope of snow, her laughter rising in little bursts that made Evelyn's throat tighten. Jake hadn't seen her yet. She hesitated for a moment behind the black iron fence, her heart suddenly racing. This was different from the plane, different from the hospital. She wasn't arriving with power or solutions. She was arriving with her heart in her hands. But Lily spotted her first. The little girl looked up mid-laugh, her eyes wide, then pointed excitedly. "Eve!" Jake turned, startled. His face registered surprise and something softer, something almost like hope. Evelyn smiled and lifted the cup in her hand. "You said to bring coffee." Jake's smile broke slowly like dawn after a long night. "You showed up," he said, rising from the bench. "You asked me to," she replied, "and I don't get invited many places without cameras." He took the cup from her, their fingers brushing just briefly. Lily ran toward Evelyn, arms wide, and Evelyn knelt down, letting herself be caught in the toddler's clumsy embrace. "You remember me?" Evelyn asked, brushing snow off Lily's hat. Lily nodded and pointed to the charm bracelet peeking from under Evelyn's coat sleeve. Airpain Jake chuckled. "She's been obsessed with that little gold plane ever since the flight." "I kept it on," Evelyn said, looking down. Felt wrong to take it off after she touched it. They sat on the bench, Evelyn holding the extra cup Jake had brought, watching Lily play in the snow, chasing her truck downhill and tumbling into laughter when she fell. "She's thriving," Evelyn said, marveling. Jake nodded. 3 weeks into therapy and she's already trying more words. She said banana yesterday, or something close to it. Na-na-na. But hey, we'll count it. Evelyn smiled. "I wish you'd told me." "I didn't know if you wanted to hear from me," Jake admitted. "You seemed untouchable." She exhaled, watching her breath fog in the air. "That's the armor. You wear it long enough, people forget there's someone underneath." Jake looked at her. Really looked. The cold painted her cheeks a soft rose, but her eyes were the same, clear, intelligent, and just a little guarded. "I didn't forget," he said. Evelyn turned to him, caught off guard by the weight of his words. "I meant what I wrote," Jake added. "You didn't make it about you. You didn't even ask for thanks. But I wanted you to see what your kindness built, that it's real." Evelyn swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. "I didn't know if I had the right." Jake tilted his head. "The right?" She hesitated. "To be in someone else's story again. To walk into a life I didn't earn." Jake leaned forward. "Evelyn, that seat on the plane. You didn't earn it either. You chose it. Just like you chose to move us up, just like you're choosing to be here now." She looked down at her gloved hands, then at Lily, who had begun building a snow fort with plastic spoons and infinite determination. "I never wanted to be seen as broken," she admitted. "But some days, I still am." Jake nodded. "We all are, but broken doesn't mean unwanted." Their eyes met again, and the hush between them was full of meaning. "I don't know what this is," Evelyn said, voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't want it to end." Jake looked back toward Lily, who was now trying to balance the toy truck on top of a snowball. "It doesn't have to," he said. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't ache anymore, the kind that felt safe, whole. Lily ran back to them, breathless and red-faced. She climbed into Jake's lap, then reached for Evelyn's glove and held it like a secret. "Stay," she said with the sincerity only a child could muster. Evelyn smiled, her heart aching and expanding all at once. "I'd like that," she whispered, and for the first time in years she meant it. Evelyn didn't remember the last time she had laughed without rehearsing it. But that morning, under a pale blue sky, watching Lily pile snow into the sleeve of Jake's coat while he sputtered in mock protest laughter, came from a place unpracticed and real. They'd spent nearly 2 hours in the playground. Evelyn had brought muffins from a cafe near her building. Jake had brought his weathered thermos of homemade coffee. Together they shared stories between bites and sips, their words drifting between them like threads slowly weaving something unseen but unmistakable. Jake was quiet in a way that didn't seek to fill space with noise. He listened, really listened, and when he laughed it started in his chest and warmed the whole bench. Evelyn, for her part, let herself lean a little closer. Not physically, at least, not yet, but emotionally. Each moment with them, the way Jake spoke gently to Lily, the way Lily looked at Evelyn with pure trust, loosened something she didn't realize had rusted shut. By noon, Lily had fallen asleep in her stroller cheeks, flushed from cold and joy. Evelyn walked beside Jake down the slushy sidewalk, her gloved hands tucked into her coat heart beating faster than she cared to admit. "You two have a rhythm," she said softly. Jake looked down at Lily. It took time. The first few months after Beth, my wife, passed, I felt like I was raising someone else's child. Not because I didn't love her, but because I was scared I'd ruin her. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't need to. "I learned by messing up," Jake added. "Sleep schedules, feeding diapers, insurance forms, I failed at all of it. But Lily never gave up on me." Evelyn smiled faintly. Children forgive faster than adults. Jake glanced sideways. "Do you?" She didn't answer right away. "Then I'm learning." They stopped outside Jake's apartment building, a red brick walk-up with iron steps and a crooked mailbox. Jake reached into the stroller to check on Lily, who stirred and mumbled something that sounded suspiciously like muffin. "She's going to be up in 10 minutes asking for more food," he said with a chuckle. "I'll take that as a warning," Evelyn replied. Jake looked up, studying her for a moment. "Would you like to come up?" It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a date. It was a moment, an invitation not into his home, but into his life. Evelyn hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because it scared her how much she did. "I can't," she said gently. "Not today." Jake nodded, no offense taken. "But I have something for you," she added. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a boarding pass. Jake frowned, puzzled. "What's this A flight?" she said. "Seattle. 3 days from now. Just a weekend. I booked 3 seats, 2 for you and Lily, and 1 for someone who wants to spend a little more time without the world watching." Jake blinked. "You want me to come with you?" "I want you to know what it's like to fly without pressure," she said. "No headlines, no foundation grants, just the sky, and someone who used to be afraid to land." He turned the envelope over in his hands, then looked up at her, searching her face. "I don't know if I belong in your world," he said quietly. She smiled. "I'm not asking you to enter my world. I'm asking you to let me into yours." Jake swallowed. "And Lily, I booked a family suite," she said, smiling. "There's a kids' museum 5 blocks from the hotel. I figured she'd want to touch everything." He laughed. "That's a safe bet." They stood there for a moment, 2 people in the middle of a sidewalk surrounded by wind and old bricks and the scent of salt from the icy street, and everything felt steady. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I ask." She reached out, touched his hand, briefly gloved against gloved, nothing skin deep, but still electric. Then she turned and walked away, not looking back. Jake watched her until she disappeared around the corner. When he stepped inside his apartment, Lily blinked open her eyes and said, "Where's Evie?" Jake smiled. She went flying. Lily sat up in her stroller, confused. Fly Jake crouched down beside her and kissed her forehead. Maybe he whispered, "We will too." He placed the envelope on the table. And, for the first time since Beth had died, he found himself making room not just in his apartment, but in his heart. for something new, for something that had begun at 30,000 feet, and was now asking to land. The sun was just beginning to rise over Seattle when Jake stepped off the jet bridge Lily tucked into his arms, blinking sleepily. She'd slept most of the flight, her cheek pressed against his chest, one tiny hand clutching his sweatshirt like it was the anchor to her whole world. Her small breaths had matched the rhythm of the engine, steady, soothing, safe. He paused in the terminal, taking in the scent of roasted coffee, the hum of early travelers, the sight of the distant mountains emerging through the windows like something carved from a dream. It wasn't Chicago, it wasn't home, but it didn't feel foreign either. And she was there. Evelyn stood just past the glass divider, simple in jeans boots and a navy wool coat that brought out the color in her eyes. She wasn't flanked by assistants or tucked behind tinted SUV windows. She stood alone, watching him, her hands loosely folded in front of her, and when she saw him, her smile bloomed. Not the one from glossy magazine covers, but the rare, quiet kind reserved for someone who mattered. Jake's breath caught just slightly. He hadn't realized how much he missed that smile. Lily stirred and whispered, "Evie." Evelyn walked forward, holding out her hands. "You made it." Jake nodded, eyes still fixed on her. "We did." She took Lily from his arms like she'd done it 100 times. Lily reached for her charm bracelet again, still enamored with the tiny airplane charm. Evelyn laughed soft and real. Jake adjusted the strap on his duffel bag. "Didn't want to assume you'd still be waiting." Evelyn looked up at him. "Jake." "I'd wait as long as it took." For a moment, neither of them moved. There was too much in the air unsaid, but felt like music you can't hear but somehow know by heart. They walked through the terminal together, Lily in Evelyn's arms, chattering about clouds and snacks and the loud whoosh when the plane goed up. Jake listened, interjecting with a grin now and then, and Evelyn matched his rhythm without trying. It wasn't orchestrated. It was organic. Outside the car Evelyn had arranged was waiting. Not a limo, not a luxury SUV, just a modest family rental with a booster seat already installed in the back. Jake chuckled. "You really thought of everything." "I had help," she said, smiling. "I asked a friend who's a single dad." He looked at her sideways. "Sounds like a smart guy." She turned to him and said without hesitation, "He is." The suite overlooked Puget Sound, its window walls casting soft morning light across a living area filled with cozy blankets, a low table set with coloring books, and a small vase of daisies. Lily was soon immersed in crayons and stickers sprawled out on the carpet. Jake and Evelyn stood nearby, coffee cups in hand, the early quiet between them thick with something fragile and beautiful. He spoke first. "You know, I thought I'd come here to say thank you. For the grant, for the hospital, for that seat on the plane." Evelyn looked at him gently. And now Jake sipped his coffee. "Now, I think I came here because I didn't want it to end." She nodded slowly. "Neither did I." There was a beat, a breath. Then Jake stepped forward just close enough to brush her hand with his. "I'm not a rich man, Evelyn," he said. "I don't have a clean past or a picture-perfect life. But I'm here. And if you ever need someone to fly with you, even when it's bumpy, I'm your guy." Evelyn's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She only reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers light steady. "And if you ever need to land," she whispered, "I'll be there waiting." They kissed, not a grand cinematic kiss, but one filled with quiet assurance. The kind of kiss that said, "You're safe now." From the floor, Lily looked up and giggled. "You kissed." Jake pulled away and laughed, brushing his hand through her hair. Guilty. Evelyn crouched beside Lily and pulled something from her bag. A small velvet box. Inside was the golden airplane charm. But now it hung from a new bracelet, this one strung with 3 initials, A.U. B, J, B, E, H. Lily gasped. "That mine?" Evelyn smiled. "Only if you promise to keep flying." Jake knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both. "I think we all are," he said. That night, after Lily had gone to sleep, curled in the middle of the king-sized bed surrounded by storybooks and hotel pillows, Jake and Evelyn sat by the window. Seattle sparkled beneath them lights on the water, distant ferries gliding like stars across the bay. Snow hadn't reached this coast yet, but the air felt clean alive. "I used to think love had to look a certain way," Evelyn said quietly. "Glossy. Grand. Photogenic." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, I thought it looked like a house with a white picket fence and a minivan." She turned to him, eyes thoughtful. "Turns out it can look like a seat-in coach. A tired dad. A brave little girl with a sticker on her forehead." He smiled. "Turns out it looks a lot like this." Evelyn reached for his hand and he took it without hesitation. The charm bracelet caught the light reflecting against the glass, dancing like the stars outside. They didn't need to say more, because some endings weren't endings at all. Some were just a beginning, in seat 2B with heart 1A, and everything they hadn't dared to hope for, finally taking flight. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Single dad donated blood and spoke 4 languages to calm foreign tourists. The CEO didn't say a word. The old air conditioning unit hummed overhead, casting a low mechanical groan across the fluorescent-lit hallway of St. Mary's Community Hospital. The place smelled like antiseptic and overripe bananas, likely from the snack tray meant for post-donation blood sugar boosts. Daniel Hayes sat quietly in the waiting chair outside the blood donation room, fingers drumming lightly on his knee, the cuff of his work shirt still slightly stained with engine grease. He wasn't here for recognition. No one ever noticed him here, and he preferred it that way. He gave blood once a month. It wasn't charity, it was routine. A ritual that made him feel useful in a world that had all but forgotten him. Mr. Hayes, a nurse called. He stood tall but modest in demeanor, mid-40s, ruggedly handsome in a quiet, worn way. There was something about the way he moved, steady, precise, that suggested he used to hold himself differently once, like a man who used to speak in front of people or to them in rooms with more power than this one. The nurse guided him into the blood donation room. He smiled politely, rolled up his sleeve, and leaned back. 15 minutes later, as his blood flowed gently through the tube into the collection bag, the hallway outside exploded into disarray. "Help! Please! She's fainting," someone shouted in a thick accent. A woman's scream followed. The nurse by Daniel's side stiffened. "I'll check it out," she said, dashing into the hallway. Daniel turned his head just in time to catch a glimpse through the doorway. A group of elderly tourists stood in panic. One woman, clearly the leader of the group, was slumped on the floor, pale and sweating, surrounded by companions who were yelling over one another in 3 different languages. French, Japanese, and he thought Italian. The front desk nurse looked utterly lost. Daniel didn't even think. He yanked the cotton ball from his arm, pressing it hard as he stood. Blood dotted his shirt. He stepped into the hallway, holding up both hands. "Excuse me," he said loudly but gently. The crowd paused, slightly stunned by the American man's sudden appearance. Then Daniel switched to French, calmly asking, "Est ce qu'elle est diabétique? A-t-elle pris ses médicaments aujourd'hui?" One woman gasped and nodded quickly, answering in rapid French. Daniel translated aloud to the nurse. Then he turned to the others, now speaking Japanese, asking one man to fetch the woman's bag. The man blinked in surprise, then obeyed. Behind him, a younger man in the group started sobbing in Italian. Daniel moved closer and spoke softly to him in his native tongue. The young man's shoulders dropped. He nodded. The hallway, once chaotic, was now subdued. Nurses were back in control. The patient was conscious breathing. The color returned to her cheeks. Daniel stepped back, arms still pressed awkwardly to his wound, his eyes scanning the room just in case anyone else needed help. He didn't see her at first. Behind the observation glass on the second-floor mezzanine, Olivia Morgan, CEO of St. Mary's Hospital, stood frozen. She hadn't meant to linger. She had a board meeting in 15 minutes and a PR nightmare to navigate from her father's shadow. But something about the commotion had made her stop just long enough to see what no one else had noticed. A maintenance man, judging by the shirt, just diffused a multilingual crisis with the calm precision of a seasoned diplomat. She leaned slightly closer to the glass. There was something familiar in his cadence, in his body language, not just fluidity, not someone who studied languages, someone who lived them. Daniel Hayes, she murmured, reading the name tag from the blood donor log on the tablet in her hand. She stared longer than she should have, not saying a word, not even realizing that she was holding her breath. Down below, Daniel gently excused himself, declining help from the nurse who noticed the blood soaking through his bandage. "I'm okay," he said. "Just let me wash up." He headed to the men's room, rinsed the blood off with cold water, and stared at his own reflection. His salt and pepper beard was uneven. His eyes were tired. But behind the weariness was a flicker of something else, something that used to live inside him before life closed the door. As he dried his hands, his phone buzzed. "Lily, Dad, remember you promised pizza tonight." He smiled. Back at the nurse's station, he signed the release form. The nurse thanked him this time with more sincerity than usual. "Sir, I don't know how you knew all those languages, but that was incredible." Daniel just shrugged. Sometimes kindness speaks better in someone else's language. And with that, he walked out the door, unaware that upstairs Olivia Morgan was still watching, still silent. But her silence wasn't indifference. It was recognition. The elevator chimed softly as Olivia Morgan stepped onto the executive floor, her heels tapping sharply against the polished tile. In her hand, she held her tablet like a weapon, sleek, controlled, and constantly loaded with information. But this time, it wasn't financials or liability reports that made her swipe through the glowing screen. It was a name. Daniel Hayes. She didn't know why she'd typed it into the internal hospital system. Maybe it was the way he'd switched languages so effortlessly, or the way the crowd had obeyed his voice like it had weight. She'd worked in public health policy for over a decade. Fluency was rare. Calm under pressure was rarer. But this man hadn't just handled panic, he'd dissolved it. She pulled up his file. Daniel Hayes, age 42, occupation freelance HVAC repair technician. Address South Maple Mobile Park Unit 14. First donation 7 years ago. Total donations 36. A single scan of his medical record told her what she already sensed: he was healthy, consistent, and almost invisible. But what stood out wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. No emergency contacts, no spouse, no employment history before 7 years ago, no insurance records, no criminal record, just blank space. Her eyes narrowed. Blank space in a life like his was rarely a coincidence. Someone knocked lightly on the office door. "Ma'am, your meeting with the community outreach director is in 5. Olivia nodded, but her attention was still on the file. She tapped the screen, saved the page under a secure folder she titled Quiet Cases. It was her habit, cataloging the people who showed up in moments of crisis but never made headlines. She believed those people were the true fabric of any institution. She just hadn't expected to find one standing in a grease-stained shirt and a blood bandage in her hallway. Across town, Daniel stepped out of his rusty Ford Ranger and into the soft light of late afternoon. The trailer park was quiet except for the distant bark of a neighbor's dog and the fluttering of an American flag someone had planted in a potted tire. "Dad," a voice called. From the steps of Unit 14. Lily, 10 years old and bursting with life, bounded toward him barefoot, a crayon still clutched in one hand. Her smile was a mix of mischief and sunshine. "You're late. I finished my homework and made you a card." Daniel chuckled, kneeling to take the folded paper from her hand. On it was a drawing of the two of them, him with a wrench and her holding a book. Above their heads floated a giant heart. "You're the best translator dad ever." He raised an eyebrow. "Translator dad. You told me you used to talk in all those languages. I saw your book collection. You've got like 6 dictionaries." Daniel smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just because you own the tools," he said gently, "doesn't mean you still know how to use them." Lily tilted her head, unconvinced. "You used them today, didn't you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the front door and ushered her inside, where the scent of tomato sauce and frozen pizza filled the air. The place was small, clean, and clearly loved. Books lined the shelves next to old HVAC manuals. A single, framed photo sat on the TV stand, a woman with bright eyes and a quiet, knowing smile. Lily's mother, gone 7 years now. Daniel stood for a long moment staring at that photo. He hadn't used French since Geneva, Italian since Rome, Japanese since Tokyo, the conference that changed everything. And yet today, when that woman collapsed and people cried out in voices no one else could understand, it had come back not like a skill, but like a calling. He hadn't expected it to feel so right. The next morning, Olivia arrived early. She hadn't slept much. She kept replaying the image of Daniel in her mind, how he translated pain into comfort. It was the kind of thing she wished her hospital could do more often, especially now. St. Mary's was under fire. Her father's old contracts had drawn scrutiny. The board whispered about selling a controlling share to a for-profit healthcare group. She had weeks, maybe less, to prove the hospital's worth beyond its bottom line. She opened a meeting with the community liaison and paused halfway through her speech. "What if we created a multilingual response team?" she asked. Volunteers trained for cultural emergencies, language customs, emotional de-escalation. The staff blinked. Olivia continued, her tone calm but fierce. "We can't control who walks through our doors, but we can control how prepared we are to meet them where they are." It was the first time in weeks her staff looked hopeful. As the meeting broke, Olivia stayed behind. She opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then she typed Daniel Hayes, invitation to consult. But she didn't send it. Not yet. Something in her told her this man didn't respond well to authority. He'd show up for people, not policies. She'd need to meet him where he was. That night, Daniel tucked Lily into bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Did you save someone today?" she asked sleepily. He paused. "No," he said softly, "but I think I helped someone understand what was happening." Lily smiled. "That's like saving someone. Just quieter." He turned off the light and sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. In another life, he used words as armor, as power, as distance. Now, for the first time in years, he wondered if his words could become bridges again. Saturday mornings in Willow Creek had their own rhythm, slow, sun-warmed, and coated in the scent of backyard barbecues and morning coffee. Daniel had the front door open to let in the breeze, a box fan humming gently in the living room, as Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by construction paper and uncapped markers. She was trying to make a birthday card for a classmate whose name she kept forgetting. Daniel was halfway under the kitchen sink, fixing a slow leak that had finally turned into a steady drip. "Is it done yet?" Lily called. "Define done," Daniel replied, wiping his hands on an old towel. "It's not leaking, which is a personal victory. That means pizza for lunch." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Is that how plumbing works now?" "Always has," she grinned. He laughed just as a soft knock landed on the screen door. He wasn't expecting anyone. Only 3 people ever visited, unannounced, his elderly neighbor, Mr. Torres, usually needing help with his TV. The mailman, usually dropping the wrong mail, or not her. Not the woman, standing in tailored slacks and a pale blouse, holding a folder and a smile so composed it could pass as impersonal, if not for the slight breathlessness in her eyes. "Mr. Hayes." He stood straighter. "Yes, I'm Olivia Morgan," she said, "CEO of St. Mary's Hospital." Daniel's brows lifted in surprise. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you in person for what you did the other day at the hospital, for helping those tourists." He stepped outside, gently closing the screen behind him. "I wasn't aware CEOs made house calls." "Neither was I," she admitted. then gestured to the park. "But I couldn't shake what I saw. You handled that situation better than any trained staff we had." He said nothing at first, just studied her. Most people tried to win trust with warmth or flattery. Olivia used precision. There was something guarded behind her courtesy. Not dishonest, just careful. "I didn't do it for credit," Daniel said. "I know. That's why I'm here." There was a pause. Then the door creaked open again. Dad Lily peeked out. "Oh," Olivia said softly. "Hi there." Lily blinked. "Are you a social worker?" Daniel chuckled. "No, sweetheart. This is Miss Morgan. She works at the hospital." "I'm not in trouble, right?" Lily asked, narrowing her eyes. "Only with me if you use permanent marker on the walls again," Daniel warned. Olivia smiled, and for the first time it wasn't the kind of smile she wore in meetings or press interviews. It was warmer, almost. Curious. "You have a beautiful daughter," she said. "Thank you," Daniel replied, his tone proud and subtly protective. "I wanted to ask," Olivia continued, "if you'd consider consulting with the hospital just part-time. We're starting a multilingual outreach program, and we could use someone with your experience." "My experience," Daniel echoed, as if trying the phrase on. "You know, I'm not licensed or trained in medicine. But you're trained in something," she said. "You don't speak 4 languages fluently because you fixed a few hotel air conditioners overseas." That made him go still. "I don't mean to pry," Olivia added gently. "But if you have a gift, and you clearly do, it would mean a lot to share it where it's most needed." Daniel glanced past her toward Lily, who had now returned to her markers, humming softly. "I've spent the last 7 years trying to build something quiet," he said. "No exposure, no titles, just stability for her. And for me." "I understand," Olivia said, and something in her voice sounded painfully sincere. "Sometimes quiet is the only thing we can afford. But I think you've got more left to give than you think." He didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he turned open the screen door and paused. "I'm not saying yes," he told her, "but I'm not saying no either." She nodded. "Fair enough." Then, almost on impulse, she added, "There's a community dinner we're hosting Tuesday night. Patients, families, staff, nothing formal, just stories and people. You're welcome to join us." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "As a guest or as a curiosity?" She smiled again, this time with the faintest hint of self-deprecation. "As someone we'd like to hear from." Then she left. That evening, Daniel sat in the backyard, an old blanket draped over the grass, while Lily laid beside him, pointing out stars. "Did you like the hospital lady?" she asked. "I don't know her. She seemed nice. She seemed interested in." Daniel didn't respond. But his mind drifted to the way Olivia looked at him, not with pity or condescension, but as if she saw past the toolbox, the calloused hands, the modest life he'd chosen. As if she knew he used to be something else. Someone else. He exhaled. "Do you think it's bad to do something big again?" he asked, mostly to himself. Lily shrugged. "I think it's good if it helps people. And if it helps you too." From the mouths of children. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia sat at her desk long after sunset. The lights of the city blinked outside her office window. On her tablet screen was the folder she hadn't closed since yesterday. Daniel Hayes. Quiet Cases. She clicked open a new page and began typing strengths fluent in 4 languages. Crisis de-escalation. Deep empathy. Risks avoids attention. Possible trauma history. Unknowns. Prior occupation. Motivation for staying hidden. Gut instinct. He's the kind of man who left something behind. Question: is he willing to go back for the right reason? She stared at that last line for a long moment, then deleted it. Instead, she typed, "Sometimes the best voices are the ones we almost didn't hear." The community room at St. Mary's Hospital didn't look like much white walls, scuffed linoleum floor-folding chairs arranged in a loose semicircle, But Olivia Morgan had spent hours ensuring that everything felt less clinical and more human. String lights hung overhead, borrowed from the pediatric ward's supply closet. Each table had a modest arrangement of sunflowers in mason jars. The food, simple homemade dishes, lined a buffet table in the corner. This was her first initiative without a press release, without board oversight, and without her father's approval. It was purely hers, and she couldn't stop watching the front entrance. "He's not coming," she whispered to herself, adjusting the hem of her blazer. "Who asked Claire, the hospital's community director, handing Olivia a cup of coffee?" "No one. Just someone I invited." Claire smiled knowingly. "It's the quiet ones. They always show up late and change the night." Daniel stood outside for a full 2 minutes before walking in. He had dressed carefully. Not formally, but respectfully pressed shirt, clean jeans boots, polished as best he could. He still felt like an imposter stepping into a world he used to belong to, but no longer trusted. Inside, he was immediately greeted by a warm din of conversation patients in wheelchairs, elderly visitors, nurses out of uniform. There was no agenda, just people. He stood near the doorway, uncertain. And then he saw her. Olivia was laughing softly with a retired doctor who was sharing stories from his days in Doctors Without Borders. Her expression was different tonight, lighter, like she wasn't carrying the hospital on her back for once. She turned, felt his presence before she saw him, and smiled. "You came." "I brought a peace offering," Daniel said, holding up a small tin. "Lily and I made cookies." "Well, she made a mess. I just supervised." Olivia laughed. "That counts." He followed her into the room, and soon enough the cookies found their way to the dessert table, while Daniel found himself seated next to an elderly man named Mr. Braddock, who was missing part of his hearing, but none of his stories. As conversations floated around the room, Daniel remained mostly quiet, listening, observing. But then a woman in a wheelchair, a woman he faintly recognized from the tourist incident, called out to him, You're the man from the hallway, with the languages." He offered a small nod. "Yes, ma'am. That was me." "You saved my sister's life." "I didn't save her. I just made it easier for help to reach her." "Same thing, sweetheart," she said, raising a cup and toast. The room quieted slightly as heads turned toward him. Someone asked, "What made you learn all those languages?" Daniel hesitated. The air shifted expectant. "Truth is," he said slowly, "I used to work in government service. International relations. I spent years learning how to speak other people's languages, how to translate pain, anger, misunderstanding into something human." He paused. His eyes found Olivia, and she gave him the smallest, most encouraging nod. "But somewhere along the line, I stopped using those words for people. I started using them for systems, for policies. Until one day, I didn't recognize who I was anymore." The room held its breath. "So I left," he finished, "started fixing air conditioners and water heaters. Because sometimes when the world feels too big, you find comfort in things that break in ways you understand." Someone murmured, "Amen" to that. Laughter bubbled up gently like an exhale the room had been holding in. Later that evening, Daniel wandered out of the room and into the quiet hallway. That's when he heard it, a soft sob muffled behind the slightly ajar door of room 2B. He knocked lightly, then stepped in. Inside was a young woman, no older than 20, sitting beside a hospital bed. Her mother lay sleeping, her breathing shallow. The daughter's shoulders shook. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, then pulled a chair beside her. She looked up, startled, but something in his presence made her pause. "I don't know what to say to her," the girl whispered. "She doesn't speak English, only Russian. And I never learned it well enough. I was born here. She raised me alone." Daniel's voice was gentle. "May I?" He stepped forward and spoke quietly in Russian, introducing himself, explaining that he was here to help. The mother stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. He leaned in closer, whispering her daughter's words. Words of love, gratitude, apology for the times she'd been too busy, too American, too far. Words the mother heard and understood, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The daughter cried too, but this time with relief. When Daniel stepped out of the room 20 minutes later, Olivia was waiting. "I saw you go in," she said. "I didn't follow. I waited." Daniel nodded. Her daughter didn't have the words, but she had the heart. Sometimes that's enough. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Olivia said softly, "You ever think maybe you were never meant to leave that world behind, that maybe the person you used to be was just waiting for the right time to come back?" Daniel looked at her eyes, tired but clear. "I think he said that part of me never left. I just needed someone to remember I was still worth listening to." She looked at him then, not as a guest or a consultant or a mystery to be solved, but as a man who still had something rare to give. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said. "You didn't just speak their language. You reminded them they still mattered." Daniel nodded. "That's all any of us really want, isn't it?" "To matter," she echoed. They stood side by side in the hallway outside room 2B as the hospital quieted for the night, two people who had spent years learning how to speak for others now, slowly learning how to be heard themselves. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window of Unit 14, casting soft gold across the worn counter where Daniel stood whisking eggs. The skillet hissed gently beside him, scent of butter and pepper filling the small space. Lily sat at the table, absently coloring a page from her astronomy workbook. "Did you like the dinner?" she asked, not looking up. Daniel turned the heat down. "I did." "Did she like you?" Lily glanced up, now eyes sharp and curious. He gave her a look. "What makes you think that—" "You came home humming," she said, matter-of-factly. "You only do that when you feel seen." Daniel paused. That wasn't something a 10-year-old should notice. And yet she had. He sighed softly and placed 2 plates on the table. Olivia's. He hesitated. "She's different. Different how she listens without interrupting. But not because she's polite, because she's actually listening." Lily nodded, biting into her toast. "That's rare. You should keep her." Daniel chuckled. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because part of him wasn't ready to say it out loud. That sometimes people who saw the best in you also had the power to see the worst and stay anyway. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to risk that again. Later that day, Daniel stepped into his workshop behind the trailer, a small converted shed lined with tool racks and dusty storage boxes. He hadn't opened one of them in years, but today something pulled him toward it. The box was labeled simply DH, State Archives. He opened it slowly. Inside, folders worn with time, notebooks filled with annotations, a State Department badge, a photo of him years younger standing between delegates from 3 countries during a negotiation that never made the news but changed 6 lives. He ran a finger over the photograph's edge, remembering not the conference room, but the pressure, the impossible expectations, the silence he was expected to keep. One folder sat alone at the bottom, unmarked. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was the letter, the one he never mailed, addressed to the Office of Internal Ethics, a whistleblower complaint. It outlined his objections to a redacted diplomatic briefing that was falsified before being delivered to Congress. He had refused to sign. And everything afterward, his resignation, the quiet pressure to disappear the jobs that stopped calling back, had stemmed from that refusal. His hands trembled just slightly. That part of his life wasn't behind him. It had merely gone quiet, like a language he no longer spoke. Across town, Olivia sat in the hospital's boardroom, a manila folder open before her. It was Daniel's full background check, or at least what had been publicly available. Most of it matched the hospital file freelancer, no criminal record single parent. But one thing stuck out, a gap of nearly 4 years after his resignation from federal service. No listed employment. No records at all. She tapped the table softly. Claire sat beside her sorting files for a separate community initiative. You look like someone who just found a ghost. Maybe I did, Olivia murmured. Claire looked over. You worried? No, just wondering why a man who can translate 4 languages and calm a room like he was born to do it would choose to be invisible. Claire smiled faintly. Sometimes people don't choose silence. Sometimes silence chooses them. And survival means learning how to live inside it. Olivia closed the file. I think it's time we give him a reason to speak again. That evening, Daniel received an envelope. It wasn't official, no hospital letterhead, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. Room 4C, Tuesday at 9 a.m. We have a patient who only speaks Arabic and won't let anyone near her child. No obligations. But we thought of you. Oh. He stared at it for a long while, the weight of the invitation heavier than its few words. He had learned Arabic during a 2-year rotation in Jordan back when he believed language was enough to build bridges across pain. He hadn't used it in over a decade. Tuesday morning came fast. Daniel stood outside room 4C dressed simply but neatly the same way he might have for a briefing minus the suit, plus 7 years of living between silence and socket wrenches. A nurse glanced up as he knocked lightly and pushed the door open. Inside, a woman in her early 30s sat curled protectively around a small child on the hospital bed. Her eyes were wide, frightened. Her hands clutched the child's shoulders tightly every time anyone in scrubs passed by the door. Daniel stepped inside, slowly, Palm's visible voice low. He greeted her in Arabic. She froze, then answered cautiously, her words uncertain. He responded gently, explaining who he was not a doctor. Not here to hurt, just someone who understood. He sat a few feet away, not approaching the bed. He let her speak. Her accent was Syrian. Her husband had died crossing the border. The child had a fever for 3 days before she gathered the courage to come here, but when no one understood, her fear returned. Daniel asked if he could translate her story to the nurse. She nodded. 15 minutes later, she smiled for the first time. The nurse entered the room without tension. The child, still flushed, clutched a toy Daniel had retrieved from the hallway, a small giraffe someone left behind. Olivia watched from outside. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd see, a man who thought he had walked away from his calling now returning to it not through obligation, but through compassion. When Daniel stepped out of the room, Olivia was still there. He said nothing. Neither did she, but for the first time there was no distance between them, only understanding, and the start of something neither one dared to name yet. The news broke just after dawn. A child admitted with a high fever, missed intake paperwork, a language barrier, a delayed treatment order. By the time the hospital realized the child was in septic shock, it was too late. The boy passed at 4:07 a.m. Olivia stared at the report on her desk, her hands trembling just enough for the coffee in her mug to ripple. The intake nurse had panicked and checked the wrong box. The child's mother didn't speak English. The interpreter on call never showed. It was everything Olivia had feared and everything the board had warned her about. Her phone rang. It was David Lang, the chair of the hospital's board. Olivia, his voice was clipped, rehearsed. You need to prepare a statement. This will go public by noon, and the board has decided it's time we bring in external leadership. I've scheduled a vote for next Friday. You'll want to be ready. She gripped the edge of her desk. This wasn't neglect. It was communication failure. This is exactly why we started the outreach. The outreach hasn't scaled, he interrupted. You've implemented pilot programs, yes, but we need infrastructure, Olivia. Liability protection. Shareholder trust. You're not here to be the heart. You're here to be the spine. The call ended before she could speak again. Olivia leaned forward, forehead resting in her hands, the weight of an entire institution pressing against her chest. Across town, Daniel was installing a new unit at a rundown laundromat when his phone buzzed. A news alert. Language barrier leads to child's death at St. Mary's Hospital. CEO faces scrutiny. He stared at the headline. The image accompanying the article showed a grainy zoomed-in photo of Olivia entering the hospital, shoulders, squared eyes unreadable. He knew that look. He'd worn it once. The mask of someone about to be blamed for a system's failure. A familiar nausea settled in his stomach. He turned off the drill, packed up his tools, and drove straight to the hospital. Olivia didn't look up when the knock came. "Come in," she said already, bracing for another reporter, another board member, another crisis. But it was Daniel. His presence filled the room not with answers, but with presence, a rare kind of calm, forged not in indifference, but in experience. "You saw," she said quietly. He nodded. "I tried Daniel. I really did. I pushed for training for hiring a multilingual staff. But they care more about optics than access, about speed than safety. And now, a child is gone." She didn't cry. That was what hurt him most. She looked like someone who wanted to cry but had been told too many times not to. Daniel sat across from her. "This isn't your fault," she scoffed. "Isn't it you don't control every intake, every form, every delay?" "But I said we could handle it," she whispered. "I told them we were building the system to prevent this." "You were," he said. "But a system built right takes time, and they're using tragedy as an excuse to strip you of authority." She looked up at him now, eyes sharper wounded. "You sound like you've seen this before." "I have," he said, "and I lost everything because I stayed silent." The silence in the room thickened. Olivia leaned forward. "What happened, Daniel? What did you walk away from?" He took a breath. "I was assigned to an international committee," he began. "We were supposed to review intel for a pending trade agreement. But one report, just one, had language that didn't match the original source. I flagged it. They asked me to let it go. It won't affect anything, they said. But it would have. It would have misrepresented an entire ethnic group, justified a policy that would hurt families. I refused to sign." "And they buried it?" Olivia asked. "They buried me," Daniel said, voice low. "Overnight, my clearance was suspended. Job offers vanished. Even people I mentored stopped calling back. The message was clear: speak up, disappear." He looked at her then, not just as an ally, but as someone who could soon face the same fate. "They're going to use this," he said. "Not to fix the system, but to replace you with someone easier to control." "I know," she said. "But you still have time." She looked at him unsure. Time to do what? To fight it, not with politics or statements, with truth, with people who'll stand beside you, not behind closed doors, but in front of them. Daniel reached into his pocket and slid a folded sheet of paper across her desk. It was a list, names of patients, nurses, volunteers, people from the multilingual outreach events who wanted to testify to speak about the program's impact, in different languages. On the record. Olivia unfolded it slowly. "How did you get these?" He gave a half smile. "I asked. Turns out kindness has a longer memory than scandal." She exhaled, then looked him dead in the eye. "Would you speak at the hearing?" "Yes. On record." "Yes, even if it brings your past back into the spotlight." Daniel nodded once. "It's already back. I'd rather be the one holding the light than hiding from it." For the first time since the crisis broke, Olivia's shoulders relaxed. Not because the storm had passed, but because she wasn't alone in it. That evening, as twilight turned the sky gold, Olivia walked into the pediatric wing and sat beside the empty bed in room 219, the boy who didn't survive. She placed a small origami crane on the pillow folded from the hospital's intake form. No press, no audience, just silence. Then she stood and began preparing for war, not with anger, but with truth, and the quiet army that had begun to rise around her. The hearing room on the 5th floor of City Hall was sterile and cold, a place where words were dissected rather than understood. Long mahogany tables divided the space between those who spoke and those who judged. Reporters lined the back wall, their camera lenses watching like predators in tall grass. Olivia stood in front of the microphone, her hands folded calmly, though every fiber of her body vibrated with the weight of what was at stake. Behind her sat the hospital board members, men in navy suits who once welcomed her as a legacy leader, and now, after one tragedy, had turned stone-faced. Across the aisle sat families, community volunteers, and patients. The room was fuller than she expected. Too full for her to believe this was just another review meeting. This was war. The chair of the review committee cleared his throat. Ms. Morgan, as CEO of St. Mary's, do you accept full responsibility for the recent death due to a language barrier under your leadership, a trap? I accept responsibility for the system I inherited, the one I've been working tirelessly to change, she said evenly. But I will not accept the notion that meaningful reform can be demanded overnight without proper investment or support. The room murmured. Cameras clicked. The chair raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting the board failed to support your reforms? I'm stating that silence isn't just a lack of language, Olivia replied. It's also a lack of commitment. The patient who died deserved better. But so do the multilingual families we've served over the past 6 months who did receive care because of the very outreach programs now at risk. She turned toward the audience. Some of them are here today. I ask the committee's permission to let them speak. A pause. The chair nodded reluctantly. They have 5 minutes. The first woman rose, elderly Spanish-speaking, with a nurse translating beside her. She spoke of the night her husband collapsed in their kitchen and how Daniel's presence in the ER made her feel safe in a place where she once felt invisible. Another voice followed a Congolese father whose son had undergone surgery, a Japanese grandmother, a Haitian teen. Each told a different story with the same ending: they were heard. Then Daniel stood. He didn't take the microphone. He stood beside Olivia instead. My name is Daniel Hayes, he began, voice firm. I've served this hospital informally for months. I've translated for patients in French, Japanese, Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. Not for pay, not for recognition, but because when someone is in pain and no one speaks their language, that pain deepens. A reporter's camera flashed. But I also come from another world, Daniel continued. I once worked as a diplomatic interpreter. I know what happens when information is distorted, when people pretend understanding isn't necessary. It cost me my career. He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. This is a copy of a letter I wrote over a decade ago. I never mailed it. It documented falsified reports that could have endangered a minority population during a negotiation. I refused to lie. I refused to sign, and I was erased for it. A ripple of silence swept the room. I've lived quietly since then, raising my daughter, fixing air conditioners, and watching a world that sometimes moves too fast to care. But I came back to this hospital not for redemption, but because I saw a woman fighting to change a broken system from the inside out. He looked at Olivia. She didn't ask me to speak, but I won't let another good person be silenced while the powerful wait for the dust to settle. He stepped back. The room didn't erupt in applause. It went still. A kind of reverence filled the air, not for Daniel, not even for Olivia, but for the truth itself. Raw, undeniable. That evening, Olivia stood in the hospital garden watching dusk settle over the city. Wind moved gently through the lavender bushes planted by the nurses on Mother's Day. Her blazer hung over one arm. Her shoes were off. Daniel approached quietly, holding 2 coffees. You were extraordinary today, he said. She turned to him. You were the earthquake. I didn't mean to be. Yes, you did, she said, and I'm glad you were. They sat on a low stone bench beneath a flowering tree. A hummingbird darted between the branches, completely unaware that 2 people below had just changed the course of something much larger than themselves. Do you regret it? She asked. Speaking the truth, no. Letting them see you again. Daniel looked up at the sky, the color of steel and fading gold. I think I've hidden for so long I forgot what it felt like to be seen and not be in danger. She didn't reply. She just leaned her shoulder slightly into his. He didn't move away. I'll still probably lose the vote, she murmured after a while. Maybe he said. But now they'll know it wasn't because you failed. It was because you refused to become what they expected. She smiled faintly. You always speak like you're translating something deeper. Maybe I am. Their eyes met something quiet and unresolved passing between them. Not a confession, not yet, but a promise that something had begun, not in a boardroom, not in a language, but in understanding. It rained the morning of the vote. Not the kind of dramatic storm that made headlines or flooded sidewalks, but a soft, persistent drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it is. Olivia stood in the staff parking lot staring up at the gray sky, her blazer draped over one-arm hair pulled into a practical twist. Inside, the board was preparing. She knew their rhythm by now, the private discussions, the casual but loaded glances, the veiled language of liability and reputation. What they didn't say was louder than what they did. She pulled her phone from her pocket thumb, hovering over Daniel's number. She hadn't seen him since the hearing 2 days ago. Not because she didn't want to, but because something in her had changed. She wasn't standing alone anymore, but that also meant she couldn't run from herself. She didn't call. Instead, she turned and walked toward the entrance. Daniel was already there. He stood just outside the auditorium, dressed in a charcoal button-down and jeans hands folded behind his back. He hadn't been asked to attend. He had chosen to. He watched as hospital staff filed in, some hopeful, some resigned. Claire approached him with a warm smile and a nod. "She's going to be fine," she said. Daniel nodded, though something in his chest pulled tight. "She's brave. She's not the only one." He gave a quiet smile, then stepped aside, watching the glass doors swing closed behind the last board member. The vote was in motion, and the outcome was out of their hands. Inside the auditorium, Olivia stood tall as the chair of the board announced the motion: to instate external leadership over St. Mary's Community Hospital and transition CEO responsibilities, effective immediately. The vote was called. One by one, hands raised. 7 members, 4 in favor, 2 against. Then came David Lang, the chair. His vote would break the tie. He looked at Olivia. For a long time, then his hand rose against. A collective exhale rippled across the room. Lang cleared his throat. The motion fails. Ms. Morgan will retain her position as CEO. Olivia didn't move. Not immediately. Then she turned, nodded to the room, and walked out. Not in triumph, but with a kind of grace that belongs only to those who have fought hard enough to earn it. Outside, Daniel stood beneath the awning, watching the last of the rain taper off. When he saw her approach, he stepped forward. "They kept you." She smiled. "No, I stayed." He nodded. "I'm glad." She studied him for a moment, her eyes quieter than her voice. "There's something I want to show you," she said. They walked in silence through the east wing of the hospital, down a hallway recently painted and lined with framed photos, patients, nurses, community members, volunteers. At the end of the corridor was a door marked Outreach Room A. Inside, a small group of patients and translators were gathered in a circle. A young nurse handed out laminated cards, each with a phrase written in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. Daniel watched as a child read aloud, "My pain is sharp." Then her mother repeated the phrase in Spanish. The translator guided her through pronunciation. It was a small thing, but enormous. Olivia turned to him. "This is just the beginning. We'll train more, fund more, bring in community leaders from every language group we serve." Daniel's eyes flicked to the banner above the doorway. "Language is care." He smiled. You're changing the system from within. You helped me remember why it matters, she said, and why it's not about speaking perfectly but listening fully. They stepped outside the room. For a long beat, neither said anything. Then Olivia reached into her pocket and handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn flyer, a list of upcoming community nights translated into 5 languages. In the corner beneath the contact name was his Daniel Hayes, lead cultural consultant. He blinked. I didn't apply. You didn't have to. He opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. I'd have to say no to a few repair jobs, he said with a smirk, and say yes to something bigger. He looked at her. Not the CEO, not the woman in the blazer and the title, but the woman who had chosen not to fold when it would have been easier. I don't have a title for what this is between us, he said. You don't need one, she replied, and then she did something neither of them expected. She reached out and took his hand. Not bold, not desperate, just steady. Language is care, she said softly, but sometimes silence says the most. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he tightened his fingers around hers and stood beside her. Because for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't translating someone else's truth. He was living his own. It was Sunday morning, the kind that unfolded gently quiet wind brushing against the window panes, the scent of cinnamon, and brewed coffee floating through Daniel's small kitchen. Lily sat at the table in her favorite hoodie sleeves, too long for her arms hunched over a crossword puzzle with her tongue peeking out in concentration. Daniel across the table was holding a pen he hadn't used in years. A real one. Not for invoices or repair notes or hospital forms, but for words that mattered. He glanced at his daughter, then looked down again at the blank sheet of paper in front of him, the kind that felt heavier than its weight. He began writing. Dear Lily, if you're reading this someday, it means I've finally found the courage to put down the things I've been carrying, the things I never meant for you to hold. You once asked me why I knew so many languages. I told you stories about traveling, about school, about fixing things for people who couldn't explain what was broken. That was only part of the truth. Years ago, before you were born, I worked with people who made decisions that shaped countries. My job was to make sure everyone understood each other word for word. I thought that if I translated well enough, no one would feel unseen. But one day, I saw something I couldn't translate into anything good. A document rewritten to hide pain. A truth bent to justify harm. I was asked to sign it. I said no. That no changed everything. The phone stopped ringing. Doors closed without being slammed. I became invisible. And maybe that was fair because I had been part of something that left people voiceless even if I didn't mean to be. When your mom passed, I didn't know how to be a father and a man without a title at the same time. I didn't know how to build a life out of silence. But then you arrived with your laughter and your stubbornness and your fire. You asked questions I didn't want to answer. And then, one day, you stopped asking and just trusted me anyway. You gave me back my voice without even knowing it. Last week I saw a little girl at the hospital. She was crying, and her mother didn't speak English. No one understood what she needed. I translated the girl's fear into words the nurses could use to save her. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. Because of you, Lily. You made me brave enough to speak again. So, wherever you go in this world, however many languages you learn, however many things you decide to build or heal, remember this. Words can tear things down, but the right ones spoken at the right time can bring people back to life. Just like you did for me. Love, Dad. Daniel folded the letter slowly, hands trembling not from fear, but from relief. He didn't know when he'd give it to her. Maybe not today. Maybe not until she needed it. But the words were real now. They existed. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Lily walked down the sidewalk toward the hospital's community garden. She skipped ahead, twirling in the last golden light of fall, her braid bouncing as she laughed. Daniel watched her like he always did, half in awe, half in disbelief that someone so small could hold so much of his heart. At the hospital gate, Olivia was waiting. She wore a loose denim jacket over a turtleneck and jeans, her hair down for once, waving in the wind like something alive. In her hands was a steaming thermos and a bag of Lily's favorite lemon cookies. "You're here," she said, smiling. Lily ran ahead to greet her, accepting the cookies with the seriousness of a business deal. Daniel approached slower, but the smile that pulled at the corner of his mouth was easier now, less like a reflex, more like a choice. "We were overdue for sunshine," he said. Olivia gestured toward a bench in the middle of the garden beneath the old oak tree where volunteers had tied ribbons with names and prayers. They sat in companionable quiet while Lily explored the rows of herbs and sunflowers. "I heard about the hearing follow-up," Daniel said eventually. "You got funding approved for the expanded outreach." Olivia nodded. 25 new interpreters, plus cultural training for all staff, full-time roles with benefits. He raised an eyebrow. "That's big. It's necessary." She turned to him, her expression softer. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Daniel looked away, not out of modesty, but because something inside him still struggled to accept being seen as part of something good again. "You did it because it was right," he said. "So did you," she replied. "You didn't just speak up. You stayed. You stood next to me." He gave a slow nod. Then she added more quietly, "You don't know what that meant to me." He did, because in her eyes he saw the same thing he'd seen in his own reflection the day he started writing to Lily, a person no longer hiding, a person building again. She reached out her hand, brushing his on the bench, and this time he took it without hesitation, not because he needed her to fix him, but because she never asked him to. They watched Lily chase a butterfly between the flower beds, giggling as she nearly tripped over her own shoelace. "I think she's going to change the world," Olivia said. Daniel smiled. "She already changed mine." The hospital auditorium looked nothing like it had 6 weeks ago. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed to a gentle amber glow. Rows of chairs had been rearranged into circles, inviting conversation rather than division. The podium was replaced by a simple microphone stand in the center of the room. Around the perimeter, small placards in multiple languages read, "Tonight we listen in every language." The event was called the Night of Quiet Voices, an idea Olivia and Daniel had co-created after the board vote. No speeches, no donors, just stories, real ones told by the people whose lives had been changed by the act of being understood. Daniel arrived early. He wore a soft, black sweater sleeves pushed up and jeans that still had traces of caulk along the seams from a morning repair job. He didn't dress for attention. He never had. But Olivia noticed anyway. "You came," she said as he joined her near the stage. "I promised I would." She looked at him for a beat, then reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small folded piece of paper. His name was written on the front. He opened it. Inside was a printed copy of the hospital's newly ratified charter, highlighted in yellow the line, "Cultural Consultant. Daniel Hayes, Founding Contributor." He blinked. "I didn't know you were submitting this to the board. I didn't ask for permission," she said. "I just gave them the truth." Daniel folded the paper carefully this time and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat like it was something sacred. Olivia continued, "I'm introducing you tonight, but the mic is yours. Say whatever you want." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm better when I don't prepare." "I know," she replied, and the ease between them said more than any script could. By 7 o'clock the room was full. Nurses still in scrubs. Elderly couples bundled in scarves, high school students with clipboards, refugees with weathered hands, people who had once walked into St. Mary's afraid unheard, unseen, and had found someone who spoke their language literally or figuratively. Olivia stepped up first, offering only a short welcome. "No introductions tonight," she said. "No credentials. Just voices." She stepped aside and Daniel walked into the center. There was no podium to stand behind. Just him, the mic, and a room full of eyes that were tired of being looked through. He cleared his throat. I never thought I'd speak in a place like this again. A pause. I used to think language was about power. If you knew the right words, you could change the outcome of a meeting, negotiate peace, avoid disaster. He looked around the room. But that's not true. Language isn't power. Kindness is. And kindness doesn't always come in full sentences. He took a breath. 7 years ago, I lost my voice not because I forgot how to speak, but because I stopped believing anyone wanted to listen. I fixed machines. I disappeared from the rooms I once walked into with a badge. He turned slightly, his gaze resting on Olivia in the crowd. But then, one day, someone believed I still had something to say, and she didn't try to translate me. She just let me speak. The room was silent. I'm not here tonight to talk about policy. I'm not here to defend a program or a protocol. I'm here because once a woman who didn't speak English trusted me to tell her story to a nurse. And her son lived. He stepped back. And that's what language really is when one human being says, "I see you," and the other finally believes it. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Then, one by one, others stood. A teenage girl who had once arrived at the ER terrified her undocumented parents would be turned away. A nurse who learned Tagalog to comfort a dying woman. A janitor who knew sign language and used it to explain test results when no one else could. No applause, no clapping, just listening. And in that listening, healing. Afterward, the auditorium slowly emptied, but Daniel remained in the center, folding up chairs with Lily, who had appointed herself hospital event manager for the night. Olivia stayed nearby, sipping lukewarm cider from a paper cup. Claire approached her. It worked. Olivia nodded. It did more than work. It reminded people who we are. She glanced at Daniel, crouched beside his daughter, laughing as she dramatically ordered him around. "You know," Claire said gently, "I think the man you were afraid to believe in again. He's standing right there." Olivia smiled, but it held a weight. "I think I believed in him from the first moment. I just didn't know how to tell him." Claire tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time you stopped translating your heart and just say it." When the last chair was stacked and the room was nearly dark, Olivia approached Daniel. He looked up, wiping his hands on a towel. "Did we pass?" "With colors flying," she said, "and no one fainted. Minor miracle." She hesitated, then offered him her hand, not as a colleague, not as a symbol. Just as a woman reaching for a man who had shown her that silence can be sacred, but words, when chosen with care, can change everything. He took it, and in that touch, something closed. Not a chapter, but a wound. She stepped closer. "You once said words can bring people back to life." "I remember." She searched his eyes. "Then say something real." Daniel leaned in, forehead resting gently against hers. He whispered, "Stay." And she did. Spring arrived in Willow Creek with a kind of quiet insistence, daffodils pushing up through the hard soil trees lining the streets in fresh green whispers, and the air full of the scent of something starting over. Daniel stood in front of Unit 14, keys in hand, a worn cardboard box tucked under one arm. The door had just been painted a soft, welcoming blue, and the rusted porch rail had finally been replaced. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Inside, Lily sat cross-legged in the center of the living room, taping a hand-lettered sign above the doorway that read, "Room 14, where words begin again." She grinned when she saw her dad walk in. Too cheesy, Daniel chuckled. Cheesy in the best way. He set the box down and looked around. The shelves were lined with more books now, language dictionaries, yes, but also storybooks in Spanish, Arabic, and Japanese. A small corner desk held Lily's drawings and a printout of her latest school essay, "Why My Dad is My Hero." There was a second toothbrush in the bathroom, and a denim jacket hanging behind the door. 2 weeks earlier, Olivia had surprised them both. It was supposed to be a short visit, just a walk through the community center's new translation booth, then coffee in the courtyard. But Lily had tugged her hand and said, "You should see room 14. Dad says it's magic." And Olivia had gone, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, curiosity, care, and maybe the hope that she could belong somewhere that had nothing to do with boardrooms or title plaques. That night, she'd stood in Daniel's kitchen with the porch light casting gold against her shoulders and said, "This feels like breathing." He'd nodded, then quietly replied, "You don't have to leave when the air changes." She hadn't. Now the days had settled into a rhythm that didn't feel rushed. Daniel continued consulting at the hospital, now mentoring a team of interpreters. Every Thursday, he hosted language and listening circles in the community garden, where people came not to speak perfectly, but to speak honestly. Olivia continued her work as CEO, though the title mattered less than it once had. What mattered now were the quiet changes she'd championed. The kind that didn't make headlines but made people feel safe. They didn't rush love. They lived it slowly, like conversation in a language neither of them had learned from books but from pain trust and beginning again. One Saturday morning, Daniel took Lily to the park while Olivia stayed back to make lunch. She moved through the kitchen like she'd always belonged there, hair pinned up sleeves rolled, humming a tune she couldn't name but somehow knew by heart. On the kitchen counter sat a small envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting. She opened it. It wasn't a love letter in the usual sense. No declarations, no grand metaphors, just 3 simple lines. "You never tried to fix me. You just gave me space to return to myself. And I'm better because you did." She read it twice, then placed it beside the sunflowers in the mason jar on the table and stood by the window watching the 2 people she loved most chasing each other beneath the new leaves. She didn't wave, she didn't call out, she just watched, and felt full in a way she hadn't in years. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the front steps of room 14, sharing ice cream straight from the tub. The sun dipped low, bathing the street in honey-colored light. Children's laughter echoed from down the block. Somewhere, a wind chime clinked softly like a bell remembering a melody. "Dad," Lily said, licking her spoon, "do you think people can really start over? Like, completely?" Daniel glanced at Olivia, then looked down at his daughter. "I don't think we ever start over," he said. "I think we just start truer." Olivia leaned her head against his shoulder. "That sounds like something someone fluent in 5 languages would say." He smiled. "Technically 6. I've been learning Korean with Lily." Lily grinned. "I'm a tough teacher." "Tell me about it," Olivia said. And they laughed, not loudly but deeply. The kind of laughter that came from healing places, from old scars finally given new names, survival strength love. As the sky darkened, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stone. He handed it to Lily. "What's this for?" she asked. "It's for the jar," he said. In their hallway sat a glass jar labeled "Kindness Kept." Every time someone did something kind without expecting anything in return, they placed a stone in the jar. Lily turned the stone in her hand, then dropped it in. A soft clink. One more kindness. One more language of love spoken without a word. And so, in a small house with a blue door beneath a sky that promised new days, 3 people who had once lived between silences built a life full of listening, full of understanding, and above all, full of the kind of love that didn't need to be translated, because it was already understood. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know where in the world our listeners are tuning in.